I told you there'd be more videos like this. Anyway, hello! Here's yet another video in which I take some characters created for Thomas and Friends and reimagine them into characters that would work in the original books. You could say I've had a fair amount of practice, and I'm certainly enjoying working on these, so it's time I started drawing. In the show, Fergus only appears in 3 episodes. He was the only character introduced in Season 7 that didn't appear again afterwards. The general consensus is that his model got damaged during an avalanche scene, but canonically it could simply be because Fergus is based at the Sodor Cement Works and we never got any episodes that take place there. In the original books, there's no evidence that Sodor has a cement works. I could do what I did with the Sodor Waterworks and just figure out a place to put it on the Sodor map, but another possible idea is that Fergus is actually his basis, the Blue Circle. Potentially, Fergus's visit to Sodor may have happened when he was based at the Bluebell Railway between 1964 and 1997. Maybe he visits alongside Stepney during a later visit, or visits on his own due to Stepney being unavailable. In Stepney's book, he mentions that some of the engines on his railway have secret names that their controller doesn't know about, such as number 488 being called Adams after his designer, and number 2650 being called Cromford after his old home. Potentially, Blue Circle is called Fergus among the other Bluebell engines, since Blue Circle is merely the name of the cement company that once owned him, and is therefore not very personal. The fact that this engine worked at a cement works, originally the Snodland Works of Holdborough Cement Company Limited before it became part of Blue Circle Cement, means that he still has a connection to cement despite there seemingly not being a cement works on Sodor. Of the 3 episodes Fergus appears in, Salty's Stormy Tale may be the most possible to adapt in a railway series style. Fergus doesn't know the way to Brendam Docks, so Salty escorts him, but a storm occurs in the night and the light in a lighthouse by the coast goes out. Salty suggests that Fergus could power the light with his flywheel, saving a ship from a nasty accident. Bill, Ben and Fergus would be harder to adapt since Fergus can't access the China clay pits. He could still meet Bill and Ben at the docks, but an avalanche can't happen there. Fergus breaks the rules is also difficult because the smelter's yards plays an important part, and so adapting this story would also mean incorporating the Sodor Ironworks into a Railway Series S canon. Saved from Scrap mentions that Edward takes scrap from Croc's scrapyard to the Steelworks, but said Steelworks isn't present on any map of Sodor, so it might be on the mainland. Perhaps these 2 stories could be told by Fergus in the form of flashbacks, with Bill, Ben, Diesel, Ari, Bert and Thomas being substituted for non-Sodor engines. During his visit to the island of Sodor, Fergus visited various lines on the railway, certainly plenty of branch lines. I've drawn him here with Oliver at Holtraw Station on the Alsborough branch. I originally included Oliver in the picture because I hadn't drawn him in one of these videos yet, but that got me thinking, how would these 2 engines interact? We've had fan interpretations of how Fergus would interact with Duck, but I don't recall seeing or hearing a story that pairs Fergus with Oliver. To keep everyone to speed, Fergus is a no-nonsense sort of character who will make himself heard if another engine isn't following the rules. As far as he's concerned, they should do it right. This could contrast with Oliver, who can be somewhat brash and full of himself. Perhaps Fergus's unconditional enforcement of rules can make him seem insensitive, and tells Oliver off for breaking rules during his escape to Sodor, not considering the fact that if Oliver hadn't done a bit of rule breaking, he probably would have been scrapped. Oliver could take offence or maybe double down on trying to wind Fergus up. Eventually, both engines realise that they're not getting anywhere, and putting their differences aside to run a reliable service is a better way to spend their time. And so, here is the finished drawing. I think there's a lot of interesting things you can do with Rosie, even if the writing teams of the TV series didn't seem to think so. It's interesting because there were multiple times throughout the show where it seemed like Rosie was about to become a main character, only for these opportunities to be squandered. I think the idea of a younger engine who looks up to Thomas is an interesting idea, and almost feels a bit sibling-coded, which I quite like. In the TV series we think of Thomas and Percy as being best friends, but when we see the two of them interact in the books, I always thought their dynamic almost felt more like a big brother and little brother dynamic. Sure, they tolerated one another and got along sometimes, but they would often bicker and try to one-up each other. Maybe Rosie would be an interesting addition as an even younger quote-unquote sibling. My idea is that Rosie was originally built by the Vulcan Ironworks as number 1277 during World War II. After performing shunting duties for a few years as part of the war effort, she was stored away, only to be purchased by the Southern Railway shortly afterwards. Following a rebuild, she was put to work at Southampton Docks in 1947. Rosie continued to perform her duties with little fanfare for a good number of years, but in the mid to late 1950s another set of engines were put to work at Southampton to give Rosie and her classmates a helping buffer. These engines were cheeky and fussy, but kind-hearted and had interesting stories to tell over the past 40 years of their existence. Rosie became good friends with several of these engines. She loved hearing the stories they told about their adventures before coming to Southampton, and their cheeky demeanours began to rub off onto Rosie. The engines were happy together for a number of years, but all good things must come to an end, and in 1962 Rosie was relocated away from her friends to become a departmental shunter at Meldon Quarry in Devon. She never forgot about the friends she'd made at Southampton, and often wondered how they were getting on. She would sometimes get her driver and fireman to write letters to her old friends, so they could still keep in touch and exchange news. However, after a certain point, Rosie's friends stopped replying to her letters. Her crew didn't have the heart to tell her what had happened up front, but it was easy enough to infer. Rosie was most upset, but she had heard whispers of another engine of their class who had moved away long ago and may still be around somewhere. Rosie remained at Meldon Quarry for 5 years before being withdrawn and put on a siding. Her driver and fireman, not wanting to lose her, started to write another letter. Around the same time, more and more goods was being transported to and from Knapford Harbour. The Fat Controller had recently reopened the Aylesbury branch line and harbour to aid congestion, but the workload was still pushing the limits of what Percy could handle. As Thomas and Toby had their own work to do, it was clear that another engine was needed. The letter that Rosie's crew had written to the Fat Controller couldn't have come at a better time. Arrangements were soon made to bring Rosie to Sodor. Upon arrival, Rosie was brought to the works to be repaired and repainted. Her formative years had been so hectic that Rosie was keen to start anew and live a childhood that she hadn't gotten the chance to experience. Up until this point, Rosie had only ever been painted black, and so she requested to be painted into pink, mainly because she'd never heard of another engine with that colour scheme and wanted to try something different. Rosie was soon ready to enter service and was put to work at Knapford Harbour, primarily as a shunter, but would sometimes take trips to Farquhar during the busy season or when Percy was unavailable. Taking trips along the branch line would often mean meeting up with Thomas, and Rosie was a little starstruck when she met him for the first time. He may have had blue paint and a straight running board, but he was unmistakably the same class of engine as the ones she'd befriended at Southampton all those years ago. Thomas found Rosie to be a little overbearing and maybe even a bit creepy at first, but didn't put up too much of a fight when it was clear that she meant no harm. Rosie explained that he reminded her so much of her old friends on the other railway, and recounted some of the stories that they'd told her back in the day. though she was tactful enough to not bring up the fact that her old friends had been scrapped. I've made some differences to Rosie's livery. I never cared too much for the white box on the side of Rosie's tank. It feels like there should be something there, but it's just blank. I didn't care too much for the red wheels either. This is probably a largely subjective thing, but I tend to prefer when engines have a fairly straightforward colour scheme. Black smokebox and red buffer beams as is standard, but then the boiler, wheels, cab and tanks, or tender, are all one colour, although I make an exception for black wheels, and then one or two different colours for lining around those parts. And so I've gone with that philosophy here. Rosie still has the red and white lining on her tanks and cab, but now the inside of that lining is the same pink as the rest of her body. I've also made her wheels pink but added red and white lining for consistency. I've given Rosie the number 12, since in this continuity she arrives a few years after Oliver, around 1968 or 69. Not counting the North Western Railway's various heritage engines, this would make her the 12th steam engine on the railway. With all that said, here is the finished picture. That's right, it's another 2 for the price of 1 drawing. I figured that Whiff and Scruff would have similar reasons to be on Sodor and would work at the same place, so I think I'm better off putting the 2 together and not repeating myself. Whiff is based on the North Eastern Railway's Aerolite, later the LNER X1. It was built to haul the saloon coach for the railway's mechanical engineer. It seems unlikely that Whiff would be the original Aerolite, especially since he has a specific industrial job that doesn't line up with the real preserved locomotive. It may be that Whiff was to Aerolite what Henry was to Gordon or the Gresley A1s, a copy built by a private locomotive builder with the intention of being sold off. Unfortunately, it didn't occur to the builders that nobody really wanted to buy a private saloon engine from some no-name, fly-by-night locomotive builder, and so Whiff remained unsold. Over the years he became something of a guinea pig, often the subject of rebuilds to make him stronger and more suited to general purpose work. This made him more desirable and was purchased for industrial use. Over the years, Whiff became something of a freelancer, travelling up and down Britain to work various industrial lines. At some point he ended up at the Sellafield power station as a shunter and learned a lot about chemistry and nuclear waste during his time here. At some point after 1952, uranium was discovered at the old lead mines on Thomas's branch line. This resulted in the mines reopening and expanding, and eventually it got to a point where the mines couldn't rely solely on the Farquhar engines to export their goods. They needed an engine with the necessary experience, and Whiff happened to be available. His job is to take special trucks of uranium and deliver them to a processing plant where it can be turned into fuel to generate electricity. The uranium trucks are extremely strong and sturdy to make sure leakages and explosions are kept to an absolute minimum, but they're still handled with the utmost care. A box van is placed between Whiff and the train to ensure that sparks from his funnel don't get anywhere near the special trucks. Whiff takes these trains as discreetly as he can along the branch line, delivering them to a goods shed at Knapford Junction where another engine will take them to a processing plant. Historically this was Sellafield, but whilst making this video we got a law drop from none other than Richard Audrey that a nuclear power plant now exists on Sodor. It is near Ballasween and is connected by rail via a newly built extension that runs through Harwick. Eventually the mining company needed a second engine and acquired an old Sentinel locomotive, aka Scruff. Now I've always quite liked Whiff in terms of both design and personality. He doesn't let the other engine's remarks about him get him down, and he is wise and knowledgeable about his job. Plus his ornate weathered green livery is typical for industrial engines of a certain era. Scruff, on the other hand, I've never really cared for. The Sentinel Shunters are cool designs, but Scruff's bright unlined green livery with some dark green stripes down the side is definitely a step back from Whiff's livery. And it's not so much that I don't like his personality, rather I don't know what his personality is. I've watched most of the episodes he's appeared in, and I still don't know. So whilst my interpretation of Whiff looks pretty close to how he does in the show, Scruff looks noticeably different, since I'm trying to make his design closer to Whiff while still keeping him distinct. I've also decided to give Scruff a personality that plays off of Whiff a bit more. Whiff is a wise old engine and a bit of a science geek, with nuclear power and radioactive materials being his special interest, but he has a very polite, reserved demeanour. Scruff, on the other hand, is a bit of a gremlin. He rushes about the yard with none of Whiff's grace and elegance, and loves seeing explosions and stuff blowing up. It's Whiff's job to keep an eye on him and rein him in. Eventually, Scruff learns that there's a time and a place for recklessness, and is entrusted with pulling the uranium trains alongside Whiff. His personality can still be quite explosive, and he and Whiff still sometimes bicker like an old married couple, but they wouldn't want it any other way. Being around radioactive materials, one difference I've made to Whiff's design is replace his glasses with safety goggles. To reflect their differing personalities, I gave both Whiff and Scruff different designs for their goggles, with Whiff's being of a more old-fashioned design. You'll notice that Scruff's face is much smaller than it is in the show. I'm still abiding by my theory that steam engines have grey faces where a door would normally go, and as you can see, Scruff's basis has quite a small door. I guess it's like Rusty, whose face got bigger between the Railway series and the TV series. With all that said and done, here is the completed image. And there you go! 3, or rather 4, new characters from the TV series, redrawn and rewritten in a Railway series style. These engines in particular were very fun to reimagine, and there's still plenty more TV series characters for me to adapt in the future, so that's something to look forward to. Be sure to subscribe if you want to see more characters reimagined.